I didn't pack much, just what I could carry in a worn leather duffel bag and the last shreds of my self-respect. I wasn't running away. I was reclaiming my life, breath by breath, step by trembling step. The house I left behind still smelled like his cologne and control. My name was Rebecca at that moment, though I'd soon change it. It wasn't just an alias. It was a rebirth. The taxi to the airport felt like a getaway car. I kept expecting flashing lights in the rearview mirror, or for his voice to call my name through the static of the dispatch radio. He had never hit me, not in the way people expect when they hear the word abuse. But emotional violence has its own chokehold. I had spent 8 years being invisible, unheard, unloved. I was headed to Portland. My best friend lived there, an old college roommate who'd offered her couch and a fresh start. My hands trembled as I handed the boarding pass to the gate agent. She barely looked at it before waving me through. If only life had been that effortless. The plane was already boarding by the time I reached the gate. I tucked into my window seat, hoping for solitude. Instead, the man who dropped into the aisle seat was anything but forgettable. He looked unplaceable. Not flashy, but refined. His watch was clearly handmade. The book in his lap, a weathered copy of The Art of War, annotated in pencil. No wedding ring, no phone addiction, just presence. Still, I wasn't in the mood for conversation. I turned toward the window, pretending to be absorbed by clouds that hadn't even formed yet. Wrong. Gate? He asked casually, as if it were a normal icebreaker. I blinked. Excuse me? You're on the wrong plane, he said, smiling. Portland's gate 11. This is gate 10. We're heading to Anchorage. I stared at him. No, this was a joke, right? I fumbled for my boarding pass, my stomach dropping faster than a free-falling elevator. His eyes didn't leave mine. I told, "The agent," I mumbled. She probably didn't notice. Small mix-up, he said. I wanted to cry. I'd been so careful, so desperate to disappear into the right version of tomorrow. Now I was heading for Alaska. I'll get off. But just then, the door closed. Too late. I slumped into the seat. I can't believe this, I muttered. You might be surprised how many lives change because of the wrong plane, he said, not unkindly. I turned toward him slowly. Do you speak in fortune cookie riddles often? He laughed, only when they're true. His name was Alexander. Just Alexander. No last name offered. No need. He was the kind of man whose presence filled the empty spaces in a room, calm, measured, like someone who had walked through fire barefoot and come out with calluses instead of scars. I didn't tell him anything about my marriage, about how I'd been living under surveillance, how a man can slice your confidence with a glance and shape your days with silence. I didn't have to. Somehow he already knew. You're not just escaping someone, he said, after a long silence. You're escaping who you were. That hit me harder than I'd expected. Isn't that the same thing? No, he said simply. Escaping. Someone is reaction. Escaping yourself is reinvention. I stared at him. Who was this man? Over the next 4 hours, the stranger beside me became a mirror, a puzzle, a key I didn't know I'd been searching for. He didn't tell me what he did, but he asked the kind of questions no ordinary traveler would. What were you best at as a child, but got punished for? I blinked. Curiosity, I answered slowly. And saying what I saw, even when adults didn't like it. He nodded. There's your power. What does that even mean? I asked. He leaned back. You've got the makings of a founder. You just don't see it yet. A founder of what? He smiled. Of the next version of yourself. And then something far bigger. I wanted to scoff, but something in me, a sleeping ember, glowed at his words. By the time we landed in Anchorage, it was dark and the airport was nearly empty. I had no winter coat, no hotel, no plan. But I didn't panic. Not this time. He offered to call me a cab. "I'll be fine," I said. "I believe." "You will," he said. Then, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, he reached into his carry-on and handed me an envelope. "Open it when you're ready to stop surviving." I watched him disappear into the snow, a ghost or an angel. I wasn't sure which. Inside the envelope was a business card, hand-pressed with gold foil initials, AK. On the back, a phone number and one line written in fountain pen. "Everything you need is already inside you. But here's a little extra," folded. Inside the card was a cashier's check for $10,000. I stared at it. My brain refused to accept it as real. No conditions, no expectations. Just a seed planted by a stranger who somehow saw soil in me. That night, in a motel that smelled like mildew and hope, I didn't sleep. I made lists, mind maps, scribbles on napkins. Who was I before I became invisible? What was I born to build? What did the child in me dream of? I remembered how, as a girl, I loved fixing broken things. Radios, watches, toaster ovens. It made sense of the world, and people always came to me when they were falling apart. I'd listen, reframe, show them the silver lining in their mess. Had two talents I'd never thought to monetize: repairing and reframing. What if I started a company that did just that? Not appliances, but people, stories, brands. That night, Second Frame was born, a concept for a consulting studio that would help struggling entrepreneurs reframe their personal and business narratives, turn perceived weaknesses into unique edges, offer a second perspective, a second wind, a second chance. I called the number on the card the next day. He answered after one ring. "You're ready," he said. He didn't offer mentorship, at least not in the traditional sense. He became something rarer, a catalyst. Over the next 6 months, we spoke only a handful of times, but each conversation was worth more than any MBA. When I asked why he helped me, he said, "I've sat where you sit. I was 32, broke, divorced, sleeping in a friend's basement with $73 in my checking account. I don't believe in charity. I believe in spark." I launched Second Frame from a co-working space in Juneau, using a prepaid phone and second-hand laptop. My first client was a woman named Hannah, an artist who'd failed to launch her Etsy shop 6 times. We reframed her as a visual therapist, not just a painter. She tripled her income within a month. Then came a retired boxer who wanted to teach resilience to at-risk youth. We rebuilt his brand into a youth-focused academy, wrapped in purpose and raw authenticity. Word spread, first locally, then online. By the time I moved to Seattle 9 months later, I had clients across 4 time zones and a waiting list. But it wasn't just about business. It was the first time I believed I could own my story instead of escaping it. The woman who boarded the wrong plane, she didn't exist anymore. I didn't call him often, maybe 3 times that entire year. But when I did, it felt like unlocking a door I didn't know I needed to walk through. Alexander was never surprised to hear from me. His voice always sounded like a lighthouse, steady, guiding, unconcerned by the storm. I remember one of those calls vividly. I had just signed my 12th client. I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and riding the terrifying high of success. It was 3:14 a.m. "I think I'm doing this wrong," I said, pacing a dimly lit hallway in my tiny Seattle apartment. "Why?" he asked. "Because I feel like I'm winging it. I'm making it up as I go." He laughed, low and knowing. "Rebecca, that is how it's done. There's no map for trailblazers." I let that settle. I was still getting used to hearing my birth name again. "You're not an imposter," he continued. "You're a prototype." That single sentence shifted me. I wasn't pretending, I was becoming. Over the next year, Second Frame transformed. I stopped calling it a consulting agency. It was a narrative engineering firm. We weren't just helping entrepreneurs. My team, which now included 2 freelancers and a part-time assistant, was dissecting the DNA of their failures, extracting the essence of their voice, and rebuilding their entire identity around truth and resonance. We worked with startup founders, burnt-out executives, struggling authors, and even a former NFL player who didn't know how to live without the roar of the crowd. Everyone had a story. Most of them didn't know how to tell it, and neither had I, until that plane ride. That man didn't just give me a check. He handed me a mirror. The business began generating 6 figures within 18 months. My calendar filled with discovery calls and client sessions. My inbox overflowed with testimonials, referrals, and interview requests. But none of that compared to the way I felt each time someone cried on a Zoom call, realizing they weren't broken. They were just misbranded. Still, the growth brought pressure. I had no business degree, no formal education in psychology or branding, just instinct, obsession, and lived experience. Doubt crept in, sneaky and persuasive. I found myself questioning whether I could scale. Whether this thing I built on passion and intuition could survive in a world that valued degrees and jargon. Whether the next chapter would be written by someone more polished, more pedigreed. So I called him again. "I'm hitting a ceiling," I told him. "No," he said. "You're hitting a mirror." I paused. "What does that mean?" "You're not limited by your business. You're limited by who you still think you are." Silence. "Who do I think I am?" I asked, hesitant. "You still think you're a woman who escaped. But you're not. You're a woman who chose. That's a world of difference." I sat with that for days. Then I did something terrifying. I fired myself. I stepped down as CEO and hired someone smarter than me. A woman named Nia, who had built and sold a PR firm and had been through her own fire. I told her, "Take this to the next level. I'm going to create what's next." She blinked. "What is next?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not afraid of that anymore." I flew back to Anchorage, this time on purpose. I wanted to see it all again, retrace the path of the woman I used to be. I booked the same motel, walked the same airport corridor, sat at the same gate. I don't know what I was expecting, but he was there, same seat, same book, The Art of War, new notes. "Missed this flight too?" he asked, grinning. "You always here?" I asked. He shrugged. "I show up when people are ready to arrive." We talked for hours. This time, I asked questions. "Who are you?" "Really?" I finally asked. He hesitated, then replied, "I used to be a venture capitalist. Now I'm a sculptor." I laughed. "You carve stone?" "No," he said. "I sculpt futures, people, possibilities. I find raw potential and chip away everything that isn't purpose." "You're not real," I said, half joking. He handed me a folder. Inside was a spreadsheet of companies he'd invested in, quietly, under the radar. Each founder was someone he'd met like he met me, accidentally, at a time they were crumbling. His returns were in the billions. "You don't even have a website," I said. He smiled. "Why would I? I'm not selling anything." "But you've built all this. Why keep it secret?" "I didn't build it for the world," he said. "I built it for them." That's when it clicked. This wasn't about building my empire anymore. It was about helping others build theirs. I returned to Seattle with fire in my chest. Second Frame was thriving. Nia had grown the team to 12, secured a TEDx opportunity for a client, and landed us a Forbes feature. I was no longer the bottleneck, I was the beating heart. But I had a new vision now. I created ignition circles, closed cohorts for underdog founders. I didn't advertise them. You had to be invited, and the only way to be invited was to be noticed. We scouted not for resumes, but for resilience, not for ideas, but for internal revolutions. Each cohort of 5 founders met for 6 weeks. Each was paired with a former client of mine who had turned their pain into a platform. No fluff, no pitch decks, just transformation. In the first year, we funded 7 businesses from those circles. One of them, a platform built by a woman who, aged out of foster care, went viral. She landed $2 million in seed funding within 6 months. We didn't take equity, not a dime, just impact. People started calling me the invisible investor. I never corrected them. But I didn't want power. I wanted ripples. 3 years after that fateful plane ride, I stood backstage at a global entrepreneurship summit in Dubai. I was the closing keynote. There were more than 7,000 people in the room and cameras broadcasting to 500,000 more. I wore no makeup, no heels, just a navy blue jumpsuit and a locket around my neck, a gift from one of the women I mentored, inscribed with the words, "Still becoming." I looked out at the sea of faces. Many had heard my story. Fewer knew that the real story wasn't mine alone, it was ours. The thousands of overlooked dreamers who had been told they were too broken, too late, too small. The story of a stranger who gave me $10,000 and a mirror. I opened my speech with one sentence. I boarded the wrong plane and found my right path. The room went silent, then leaned in. That night, back in my hotel, I received a package. No return address. Inside, a familiar book, The Art of War. But this time it wasn't annotated. It was blank. Every page. On the inside cover was a handwritten note, "Your war is over. Now write peace." I cried like I hadn't in years, not because I was lost, but because I had finally arrived. Success, I've learned, doesn't silence your demons, it just gives them better costumes. At year 4, I stood at the helm of a movement I never set out to lead. Second Frame was now a recognized force in narrative strategy. Our ignition circles had created ripple effects across 3 continents. Former clients were being featured in Fast Company, TechCrunch, and Harvard Business Review. And yet, I found myself awake most nights. It wasn't burnout, it was incompletion. The applause was louder, but so was the silence when the lights went out. And in that silence, I started hearing a voice I thought I'd left behind. His voice. My ex-husband hadn't reached out, not once. But that didn't stop the echo. "You're nothing without me. No one's coming to save you. You're only good at pretending." His words had once been my truth. But now they were just outdated programming, glitches in a system I hadn't fully rewritten. So I decided to do the unthinkable. I reached out to him. I didn't want revenge. I wanted closure. I needed to look him in the eye and confirm that I was no longer the woman he could reduce with a glance. He met me at a coffee shop in Boston. The air was brittle. We hadn't seen each other in over 5 years. He looked older, smaller somehow. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't need to. I just told him thank you. "For what?" he asked, visibly thrown, for being the storm that forced me to build my own shelter. He said nothing, just blinked. I left without finishing my coffee. On the way back to the airport, I called Alexander. "I finally let go," I told him. "Of him?" "No," I said. "Of the part of me that needed to prove I could." That moment triggered a new season. Not of growth, of refinement. I took a sabbatical, traveled solo across Eastern Europe. No press, no clients, no name tags, just observation. In Romania, I met a woman who taught coding in orphanages using recycled laptops. In Slovenia, I spoke to a 19-year-old immigrant building a decentralized currency for stateless people. In Georgia, I met a baker who created a community kitchen for mothers escaping trafficking. None of these people saw themselves as entrepreneurs, but all of them were solving real problems in quietly revolutionary ways. I returned home with a new mission, to fund impact-first founders who didn't speak the language of venture capital. I sold 51% of Second Frame to an aligned strategic partner. The payout was high 8 figures. I reinvested 90% of it into a blind trust called the Ember Fund. No press releases, no photo ops. We deployed microgrants, 5K to 25K, with no strings attached. All recipients were nominated, not self-submitted. Our only rule: if you create value for a community that's often ignored, we'll create value for you. Within the first year, we supported 170 initiatives. One built an app to help deaf children learn to read lips in rural India. Another created a drone-based delivery network for medicine in flood zones across Central Africa. And just like that, I stopped being the center of my story and started becoming the stage. But success isn't a straight line. In year 5, my first major failure, HIT, a founder we backed, charismatic, brilliant, turned out to be fabricating data. They'd built a wellness platform with all the right buzzwords: mindfulness, inclusion, tech for good. But behind the curtains, it was a facade. Fake users, inflated results, ghost employees. I'd personally endorsed her. The backlash was swift. Headlines labeled me reckless, naive, gullible. It stung. Not because they were wrong, but because I had violated my own rule: trust but verify. I took full responsibility, issued refunds, apologized to our community. Then I went offline. That's when Alexander called me. For the first time, he initiated the call. "You needed this," he said. "Public disgrace?" I asked dryly. "No," he replied. "Evidence that your integrity is bigger than your image." He was right. I'd been floating too high, too safe. I went back to basics. I built a vetting board, composed of former grant recipients. I put founders at the center of due diligence. I decentralized the Ember Fund's approval process. Within 6 months, our reputation rebounded, stronger than before. But more importantly, we started hearing from the kinds of people we really wanted to reach, like Maya. Maya was 16 when she pitched us. She lived in a remote part of northern Canada and ran a solar-powered radio station that broadcast in 3 indigenous languages. Her goal was to keep her culture alive. She didn't ask for money. She asked for mentorship. We gave her both. 6 months later, she was profiled by BBC World News. A year after that, she was invited to the UN Climate Summit. Her story reminded me of my own beginning: unpolished, unexpected, and completely unstoppable. That's when I realized my purpose wasn't just to fund innovation, it was to create mirrors for people to see who they already were before the world told them otherwise, just like Alexander had done for me. Then one day the news came. Alexander was gone. No obituary, no public announcement. Just a quiet email from someone who referred to herself only as M. It read, "He asked me to tell you this, if the time ever came. You became exactly what I hoped for, and far more than I imagined." I didn't cry. I smiled, because I finally understood what he had done. He didn't save me. He activated me. And now it was my turn to do the same, for as many people as I could. So I created the Wrong Plane Project, an anonymous global fund that secretly seeds strangers who are at rock bottom, but whose eyes still carry fire. We work with flight attendants, hotel clerks, librarians, soup kitchen volunteers, anyone who sees people the world overlooks. They nominate individuals who are quietly trying to change their lives. We don't offer charity. We offer belief, a letter, a card, and a check. Sometimes $500, sometimes $50,000, always with the same note. You're not just escaping something, you're becoming someone, and always signed, a stranger who sat beside you. The first time I saw my net worth cross the $1 billion mark, I was barefoot, making tea, listening to Nina Simone. There was no applause, no celebration, just a quiet notification from my wealth manager that the latest equity stake in a social fintech venture had pushed me over the threshold. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop. I used to think becoming a billionaire would feel like a mountaintop moment, a parade of power, pride, and prestige. It didn't. It felt like gravity, like responsibility heavier than gold, like everything I'd been entrusted with wasn't mine to hoard, but to harness. People started writing about me. They called me the invisible billionaire, the mirror builder, the accidental mogul. Every headline wanted to shape a legacy for me. But I wasn't interested in legacy. I was interested in multiplication. We scaled Second Frame into a global institute, not a company, an ecosystem. We trained ex-convicts, refugees, retired teachers, disabled veterans, and single moms to become certified narrative strategists. Over 2,000 people graduated from our accelerator within 5 years. Many of them out-earned me within a year, and that's when I knew we were winning. When your students outgrow you, you've done something right. I also launched Echo Labs, a venture studio dedicated to building tools that turned untold stories into sustainable platforms. We funded 40 startups in our first 2 years. One of them, a voice-to-text accessibility AI for low-income students, was acquired by Google for $400 million. I didn't negotiate for equity or a board seat. I negotiated for a clause that their tools would always remain free for students under 18 from underserved communities. Impact, not ownership. That became my mantra. I wasn't here to own empires. I was here to unlock them, and yet. The more I built, the more I realized something. People didn't remember the projects. They remembered the letters, the notes from the Wrong Plane project, the quiet belief that showed up at rock bottom. A woman in Turkey wrote to say her note arrived the day she planned to take her life. A man in Detroit said it paid for his final exam. A mother in Nigeria said it bought her first sewing machine. Not one of them knew who I was, and that's exactly how I wanted it. At age 44, I stepped away from all my companies. I appointed a new board, composed entirely of women from marginalized communities. I transferred 70% of my equity to an evergreen trust fund structured to outlive me by 100 years. Every dollar it earned was earmarked for reinvestment in overlooked human potential. I moved to a quiet coastal town in Portugal. No assistant, no entourage, just books, an old dog I rescued, and a tiny house with a wide window facing the Atlantic. Some days, I still wake up disoriented. I forget I'm not that woman hiding in a motel room, bruised and broken. Then I remember. I'm her, and I'm also who she became. Once a year, I board a random flight, no destination in mind. I just pick the gate that feels most unexpected. I sit beside strangers. I listen more than I speak. Sometimes I leave behind a book. Sometimes a letter. Sometimes a quiet question that once changed my life. What if this detour is the beginning of everything? And once, on a return flight from South America, I sat beside a girl, early 20s. Pale, wide-eyed and shaking as she clutched a crumpled envelope in her lap. We spoke for hours. Her story echoed mine. Different details, same theme. Running, escaping, barely breathing. She didn't know who I was. I didn't tell her. Before we landed, I slipped her a card. The same kind I'd received years ago. This time it read, "You're not just escaping something. You're becoming someone. I believe in you." She cried. So did I, because I knew. One day she'd be the stranger handing that letter to someone else. Final reflection. If there's one truth I've learned, it's this. Power is not found in the spotlight. It's passed in the shadows, quietly, courageously, relentlessly. I boarded the wrong plane, and I found the right life.